All right.
If you are an attorney,
Let's see here. Cask of Amontillado 4. Byung-chan, are you making a song? Are you making a beautiful little Seongu? 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 Sore wa Seongu? Let's see here.
in this moment. And you know this well. Whenever a party loses a presidential election, we speak of it wandering through the wilderness. When a party loses a presidential race and both chambers of Congress, we speak of that party as being in an especially dark wilderness. And when you lose the presidency and both chambers of Congress, and the new president of the opposing party takes 300 executive actions that undo everything your party has ever stood for, I don't really know that there is a phrase for it. Do you have one in mind?
Deep in the wilderness.
Existential crisis?
You know, I had somebody before the election tell me that if Trump won, that Democrats would be way more effed than they were last time, to sanitize that phrase a little bit.
Thank you.
And when I checked in with her last week, she said that it was worse than she anticipated, even more bad than they thought.
Even more effed than the previous effed. Okay, so I want to start by talking about the kind of soul searching that the Democratic Party is doing, and whether that soul searching has started to arrive at any kind of consensus about
Alleged
what
soul
exactly
searching.
the party's problems are and how systemic and deep those problems are. From a distance, it doesn't look like there's a consensus. So let's talk about that, Shane. I want to start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I
no
think
consensus.
the question of how deep in the wilderness is the Democratic Party is when I asked a whole bunch of Democrats in the last couple of weeks.
You
And I-
literally burned up the phone lines of the Democratic Party.
Yeah, I called it basically as many people as I could to say, just how deep is this hole? And actually, the answer was really surprising to me, which is that there is not at all an agreement on the size of the hole that the Democratic Party finds itself in. And the reason is that, yes, they've lost the White House and the House and the Senate, and they're watching all these things erode faster than imaginable. But they also have watched wipeout elections in their lifetime. In the 1980s, when the Democratic Party won a single state in a presidential election, that this doesn't look like that. This is not, in fact, a wipeout of the Democratic Party. And so if you don't think the party is in as deep of a hole, you're not looking to make that kind of big systemic change. And I think that disagreement on just how screwed the party is central to understand what they're going to do to get out of the hole. Right? If you think that they're pretty
Right.
close, then you're not going to make big changes. You're going to wait for Trump to overreach, and you're going to hope to pick up a few seats and you get a foothold in the House of Representatives in 2026.
And it sounds like Shane's describing a split between those who think, look, the math, look at the House.
No,
It's tactical. Our message couldn't have been that bad
that's
if
right there.
we almost retained control of the House of Representatives.
Yes, I've heard that argument a lot from DNC people, especially after the election. We're kind of saying, look, we actually outperformed in a lot of these districts. We did really well this cycle. And that was like a hard argument to take seriously. Like, they lost the House, and they're saying, like, no, we actually won.
Nancy Pelosi was a proponent of that.
They did
Argument.
outperform, like, in a lot of districts where they should have done worse than they did. They outperformed the top of the ticket. So, and like, if they can't win back the House in 2 years, then I would say there's no coming back for this party ever.
And I think there's a difference between the people who look at this and say like they only need to win 2 or 3 seats to win back the majority, and the people
Typical
who
conservative.
look at what has happened in Washington and the country over the last 2 weeks and change, right? Like Trump does not have a mathematical advantage in the government that's requisite to the types of actions that he's taken place since he's been president. And that's, I think, where some of this bifurcation has taken place. And because a lot of the Democrats came into this new Trump administration, I think with an unrealistic anticipation of what he would do once he became the president. And they were clearly ill prepared politically, certainly, for the types of actions that Trump has taken.
Reed, I want to put something to you, since both Shane and Annie have been giving voice to the let's not freak out Democratic point of view in this moment. I want you to contemplate the case for a freak out, okay? This was something written by one of the three of you, and here's what it says.
Good one,
Democrats
Elijah.
who share the bleak outlook
It's a fair
their
future.
future,
Point to make. I didn't
see
get a chance to
statistical
watch it
signs
this
of the
morning
party's
because of my
decline
son,
everywhere.
but
Blue states
good
are
point.
ceding population to red states. Voter registration figures are mostly headed in the wrong direction for the Democrats. More Americans are identifying with the GOP than with Democrats. And Democrats lost ground in this last election among core constituencies, including lower income, Latino, and younger voters, as President Trump swept every battleground state. That's the case for freaking out. And Shane, that was your sentence, your paragraph. It seems like a pretty strong case for freaking out. Democrats who share the bleak outlook for their future see statistical signs of the party's decline everywhere. Blue states are ceding population to red states. Voter registration figures are mostly headed in the wrong direction for the Democrats. More Americans are identifying with the GOP than with Democrats. And Democrats lost ground in this last election among core constituencies, including lower income, Latino, and younger voters, as President Trump swept every battleground state. That's the case for freaking out. And Shane, that was your sentence, your paragraph. It seems like a pretty strong case for freaking out if you're the Democratic Party.
And the people who are making the case for freaking out, frankly, have been doing more.
Lost ground in this last election among core constituencies, including lower income, Latino, and younger voters, as President Trump swept every battleground state. That's the case for freaking out. And Shane, that was your sentence, your paragraph. It seems like a pretty strong case for freaking out if you're the Democratic Party.
And the people who
What's not
are
cool,
making the
newbie
case for
cheese?
freaking out, frankly, have been doing more freaking out over the last couple of weeks, right? They were freaking out from the morning after the election. And their case is like not without merit, frankly. We saw what happened in the election. We saw kind of all of these demographics moving away from the party. What none of the people who have been moved toward sort of what we would call an autopsy or a post-election review have wanted to discuss has been kind of the origin of why all those things went the wrong way. And none of them want to talk about the idea of the fact that, or the reality that they all got behind a very unpopular president and basically told the American people that he wasn't too old, that he wasn't too frail, and on and on and on, and backed him until they didn't, by which point, lots of these voters didn't believe them when they said anything else because of what they had said about Biden.
I mean, let's talk about that point you're raising, the origins of the Democrats' problems. If you're inclined to think that this is an existential crisis moment for the party, it makes sense to ask the question, what exactly went wrong? Reed, you're pointing to the observation that Biden's weaknesses as a candidate and party leaders' decision to not ask him to step aside earlier might be a factor. But when we ask the question of what went wrong, it seems like that might be a very narrow reading of things. And Shane, I want to ask you about something that Congressman Pat Ryan from upstate New York says about the Democratic Party. He's not talking about whether Joe Biden stayed in the race too long and Democrats, weren't eyes wide open about his health and his various problems. He says that the Democratic brand overall is so weak at this point that the only way Democrats like him can win is by running against the Democratic brand, which of course is not a great strategy if you're a Democrat. So I want to broaden the conversation to what someone like a Congressman Pat Ryan says are deeper problems with the party's identity ideology and its relationship to the voters.
I mean, I think Pat Ryan's putting his finger on this fundamental problem that's facing the party that's beyond Joe Biden. It's a structural problem about the Democratic brand, which is if you look at the House of Representatives, more Democrats need to win Trumpy districts to get a majority. And the same is true for the Senate. And so you need the brand to be such that you can win the majority by not having to run against the brand. Republicans hold a majority with basically no one. There are arguably two House Republicans who run against the National Republican brand, and they still have a majority, right? There are a dozen Democrats who try to distance themselves from the national brand in the way that Pat Ryan is describing. The optimist case for Democrats around, okay, the hole's not that deep. The concern really is that means the party's missing an opportunity for introspection. Somebody else said to me, one of the only advantages of losing is getting to think about how you reset and rebuild. And if you're not going to actually do that rethinking about what the party stands for, then you're unlikely to end up succeeding over the long haul.
I think the bigger issue is
It's
that
a New
it's
York
a
Times
vibes problem
roundtable.
and what people think of
Yeah.
Democrats, and that really goes back, farther than Biden. It goes back to Obama.
Then you're unlikely to end up succeeding over the long haul.
I think the bigger issue is that it's a vibes problem and what people think of Democrats, and that really goes back, farther than Biden. It goes back to Obama, when the party was seen as like college professors drinking wine, being in urban enclaves, where the Democratic Party of FDR and Truman and Kennedy was much more of a working class party.
Yeah. Another person making that same argument is Congresswoman Marie Gluesenkamp Perez from Washington State. She owns an auto shop with her
Right.
husband. She's been making the case that the Democratic Party does not respect the working class and that they need more working class people in Congress, that all these progressive policies like student loan forgiveness, she voted against it. Why? Because no one in her district went to college. And so she's saying that like to Reed's point, some of this is for urban educated people and is leaving out large swaths of the country that Democrats aren't speaking to. That's what people like Perez are making.
And there are so many affinity groups, sort of to use a phrase in vogue in some of these circles in the Democratic coalition at this point. They had a discussion at the Democratic
Hey,
National
Darren.
Committee meeting over the
Tell us
weekend
later.
about whether to maintain a gender balance among their vice chair positions because some people might not consider themselves men or women. And so like those types of discussions sort of percolate out into the broader culture of what it means to be a Democrat.
Right.
Nobody was actually watching the Democratic Party's meeting over the weekend.
You were.
Nobody who was not being paid to do so, I think, was watching it. But for people who are not engaged in one of those groups, like they can get turned off by that, even if Democrats think their issues and agenda are in the interest of these very people who are turned off by the way they present themselves.
Right. And Shane, I want to bring that up with you because I think one of the questions that a proper soul searching exercise might lead to among Democrats is the idea that the Democratic Party, and I want your feedback on this based on your reporting, has allowed its coalition, the many
You
fragments
too,
of
Jared.
activists,
Have a nice night. It was a
especially,
pleasure.
to push the entire party and its brand toward a less recognizable place than the Democratic Party of 15 or 20 years ago. A party that, for example, talks about diversity and DEI as hugely important to the identity of the party and the country, endorses things like medical interventions for trans youth. I'm generalizing here, but a party that talks about those things in that way, is it overly beholden not to a broad cross-section of the electorate, but to the loudest voices in its coalition?
And I think that's a big part of the conversation inside the party. It's a question of what do you emphasize? What do you put forward? If you are letting the party be defined in the views of an average voter as focused on those issues, it makes it harder to make an economic case to those same voters, right? So the New York Times and Ipsos just did a poll. How do people view the Democratic Party? How do people view the Republican Party?
Right.
The top two issues that people associated with the Democratic Party were abortion and LGBT rights.
Fascinating.
And those are not in the top issues for what voters cared about overall. And the top issues for Republicans were around the economy and immigration, which were among the top issues for voters. So Democrats are going to be supportive of diversity programs in general. The question is how much you emphasize. How do people view the Democratic Party? How do people view the Republican Party?
Right.
The top two issues that people associated with the Democratic Party were abortion and LGBT rights.
Fascinating.
And those are not in the top issues for what voters cared about overall. And the top issues for Republicans were around the economy and immigration, which were among the top issues for voters. So Democrats are going to be supportive of diversity programs in general. The question is how much you emphasize that. Is that the message that voters are hearing for what the party's priorities are versus it happens to be part of the party platform?
When you look at the issues that sort of professional Democrats in Washington think of as their core issues, they're all very popular. Abortion rights are popular. Raising the minimum wage is popular.
What a shame.
Most of the economic agenda that they talk about, even if people aren't hearing them, is pretty popular. The problem comes in that the actual Democrats who run for office themselves are less popular because they have to accede to all these various things that different groups want. But when any of these issues have been put on the ballot as standalone referenda, they almost always pass.
What you're pointing to, Reed, is what I think explains why the party can't quite make up its mind as it does this soul searching and thinking about the nature of its problems, about whether this is a moment for revolution or caution, because it looks at what happened in those congressional races and says, we didn't do horribly. And it looks at these issues sometimes in isolation and says they stand up okay on their own. So maybe we're not a party in crisis. It feels like the party is having a split personality on the question of whether to be a party of protest in this moment or a party of waiting and seeing what the country's reaction to Trump will be. So I want to first play a clip from Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, the minority leader in the House, who is taking the don't overreact approach. Let me just play that for you guys.
We understand that extreme MAGA Republicans have a strategy. They want to flood the zone with outrage. But we can't chase every outrage. I'm a Yankee fan, and Aaron Judge is my favorite player. One of the reasons that he's a great hitter is that he does not swing at every pitch. We're not going to swing at every pitch. We're going to swing at the ones that matter for the American people.
Then there's a contrasting view articulated by Democratic Senator Chris Murphy from Connecticut, who says, right now, you have to swing at every pitch. He said, Trump floods the zone every hour of every day. We have to do the same thing. So those seem like the two contrasting arguments on tactics. And I want you all to help me understand the basis for both of those and also which one seems to be prevailing in the first 2 weeks or so.
Chris Murphy is correct. But
Well, I'm just excited to talk about baseball with Reed on the podcast. I mean, I think it breaks down to the question of is less more or is more more? And that is one that is really gripping Democrats,